Fallik said that he'll stick around afterwards as well to help address some of the questions. Before we start, I want to recognize our program sponsors and also thank the generosity of our board members, Karen and Ram, who are also co-hosting and helping us out tonight, the Pomerances. So this special series is offered for free and open to the public because of their generous support and donation for tonight, and we thank them for joining us and being here with us. Also, our other co-host who's stepping in tonight, Joasia Simon, we really appreciate her being with us and helping us through, our governance committee chair. We couldn't do all that we do without her. We're grateful for their support and are very glad to have you all joining in with us tonight. If Bill is there with us, I know he's having some technical difficulties, and he's our chair of our board who's also joining in with us tonight as well. We hope that is working out. I'd also like to thank our OLLI Fort Lauderdale Advisory Board, Marketing, Curriculum, and Development Committees who actually came together and conceived this programming. And they're amazing to work with, and I really thank them for their time, their energy. Gail Kapp, BJ McKenzie, Marcia Levy, Kathy Molinet-Drum, Allison Warner, our Director of Development. I want to thank Gail, Polly, and Susie from the College of Arts and Letters who are here tonight that are supporting our efforts as well too. We really appreciate that, and they're teaching us the ways of Zoom. And to all of you tonight who are participating, it's great to see all of you. Share this series with your friends. Join us for the remaining two in the program. We appreciate your support of OLLI Fort Lauderdale and this series and tonight's program, Defunding Police, Phenomena and Consequences, that we'll be hearing about shortly. It is now my pleasure to introduce the interim dean and professor, Nailise Luna from the College of Social Work and Criminal Justice.
Thank you, Adrienne, and nice to be here. It is my pleasure and my honor to be here with all of you this evening. My name again is Dr. Nailise Luna, and I am the interim dean of the College of Social Work and Criminal Justice, which became FAU's newest college on July 1st. I'm here to tell you a little bit of who we are and to introduce our headliner for this evening. So let me start by telling you a little bit about our college. Our college has two schools in it. It has the Sandler School of Social Work, and it has the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Both schools are change makers, driven to transform and empower individuals, families, communities by advocating for justice, mobilizing strength and resiliency, and promoting equality across our one human race. Our mission is guided by our values of dignity, respect, inclusivity, excellence and innovation, and integrity, justice, and service. We have over 70 faculty and staff members, many of whom are recognized nationally and internationally for their research and expertise in the field. Our college has over 300 agency partnerships from Miami-Dade all the way up to Vero Beach. We have 5 academic degree programs. We have 2 undergraduate programs, one in social work and one in criminal justice. We have 2 master's programs, one in social work and another one in criminal justice. And we have 1 doctoral degree program in social work. Now, these programs graduate students who are fully prepared and inspired to make a real and long-lasting difference in our communities. We prepare our students to be the social workers, the justice leaders, scholars, practitioners, policymakers of tomorrow. One of the reasons that we're here is because now more than ever, the world needs our graduates who are ready to evaluate criminal justice and social service policies and practices. They're ready to address discrimination and injustice in systems and processes. They tackle issues related to brain health and mental health, such as trauma, depression, anxiety, addiction. We also provide direct service to vulnerable populations. We restore justice, and our students promote equal access to care. Those are some of the things that we do and we train our students to do. Now, this Dialogues for Change series provides necessary conversations that are near and dear to our College of Social Work and Criminal Justice. If our mission resonates with you, please reach out to me. There are countless ways that you can support our work, that you can get involved, and I welcome the opportunity to connect with you. Up in the screen, you have my contact information. Please take note of that and reach out anytime. We do amazing things in our college. We offer workshops and webinars to our community. We offer events to engage all of you with our FAU family. We need your support and we love your involvement. So I look forward to hearing from you. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's headliner, Dr. Seth Wyatt. And his presentation addresses a very high profile topic in our society today, one that is vital for all of us to be educated on. Dr. Falik is an assistant professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice and an affiliate faculty member for the Center for Urban and Environmental Solutions at FAU. He received his Doctor of Philosophy in Criminal Justice from St. Houston State University in 2015. Much of his research involves ongoing research practitioner collaborations. He has been published in top journals in the field of criminology and criminal justice. His expertise is in police public relations and the efficacy of criminal investigations. Dr. Falik has written extensively on accountability, procedural justice, officer decision-making, the utility of forensic evidence, racial profiling, depolicing, and the Ferguson effect. In 2019, Dr. Falik received FAU's Presidential Award for Faculty-Led Community Engaged Research. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Seth Wyatt.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I want to begin by thanking Dean Harswell and Dean Luna and Adrian for coordinating this presentation to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. I also want to thank Dan and Karen for sponsoring this talk. It's timely, it's important, and you guys are at the forefront of these discussions, so thank you very much. Now, before I get into the sort of meat and potatoes of this presentation, I want to acknowledge that I am not, nor have I ever been, a police officer or a person of color. I don't report to understand their lived experiences. And for the most part, I think it's really important that they be guiding this discussion. I am a translational scholar, which means that it's my job to understand other literatures and to understand how they have implications for other fields. So today's talk is actually going to be at the intersection of a lot of separate disciplines. Now, to that end, I've been really fortunate to have worked with law enforcement and communities of color, particularly those that have been impacted by the criminal justice system and done so in several capacities. And today, obviously, we're going to be talking about the issue of defunding police. So we can't have this discussion without first acknowledging the broader conversation of race in America and our history of racialized policing. You know, these are facts, they're undisputed, and there's a strong consensus in the professional and academic communities about the historical and the continued marginalization of racial and ethnic minorities. Now, the roots of this can be traced back to colonial America and slavery, which has also been maintained through things like Black codes and Jim Crow laws. So while this Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited some formal discrimination, it was replaced with less overt forms of animus. And the most obvious examples of these exist in today's criminal justice system. Racial and ethnic minorities are overrepresented at every stage of the criminal justice system. And just as a point of clarification, when I say racial and ethnic minorities, I'm talking about Black and brown folks. They're more likely to be victims. They're more likely to have their cases adjudicated, more likely to be found guilty, more likely to receive larger sentences. And this is while, and this is the important fact, while controlling for all other relevant case factors. Perhaps the most startling fact of our criminal justice system's bias is that 1 in 3 Black males will come under the supervision of the criminal justice system at some point in their lives. 1 in 3. So police are no exception to these trends. In fact, in many ways, they've been the tool of control for Black and brown bodies. Racial and ethnic minorities are both over-policed in terms of contacts and under-policed in terms of their responses when police are called. Now, if we're talking about the over-policing of racial and ethnic minorities, we're talking about the increased likelihood of being stopped, searched, ticketed, arrested, and have use of force used against them. Now, police are going to contend that their presence in minority communities is tied to area calls for service, for which communities dictate, and area crime rates, which are also community driven. So we know empirically, however, that racial and ethnic minorities are no more likely than their white counterparts to violate the law. There's a fascinating literature in this space. It looks at self-report data. Just to give you a sense, one of the traffic studies out there looked at when red light cameras were installed, which have no racial or ethnic bias attached to them, and Black and Hispanic and other minority groups were equally likely to violate the law. Now, this has contributed to a concentration of poor police community relations among racial and ethnic minorities, especially in the last decade, which has shed some new light on these issues. So over the years, it's important to recognize that we've asked police to do more. We've asked them to deal with people and issues that are at the margins of society. In many cases, they have no training or expertise in dealing with these populations. And so I think they would be the first ones to acknowledge that there's been a bit of mission creep, which has resulted in them being overextended in a number of ways. Additionally, the public is increasingly had access to video-enabled smartphones and has been connected in ways they've never been before through social media. As a consequence, use of force incidents involving Rodney King, Michael Brown, George Floyd, and too many more names have been seen the world over. Now, expectedly, law enforcement legitimacy has declined, and this is directly observable in the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, some agencies have embraced these criticisms and made incremental changes. Now, unfortunately, many more have not. In fact, many have insulated themselves from community backlash. Police have withdrawn, for example, from activities they've no mandate to undertake and fortified themselves with military-style tactics, operations, and weaponry. The former, the sort of withdrawing, this is known as depolicing. The fortifying with military-style tactics, that's known as militarization. So depolicing has occurred in part because officers don't want to risk becoming the next viral video. And militarization has been accelerated as military surplus has been cheaply available to local law enforcement in the wake of 9/11 and a lot of money that was the Department of Justice and Department of Defense had made available. We have some research in this area on the impact that depolicing and militarization has had on crime. Unfortunately, there's no consensus in this area. So you have some research that's saying that crime has gone up. Others said that it's gone down. So there's some anecdotes. You know, a lot of folks are sort of suggesting right now that it's a mixed impact. So it's going to have a differential feeling for different communities and different crime types. And so given what we know now about race, America, and policing, how are we to make sense of defund policing calls? There's a couple of frameworks that I think I want to begin with that'll help guide our discussion the rest of the way. So the first is the comparative perspective, and the second is the consumer perspective. So the comparative perspective asks us to evaluate how policing looks in other countries and domestically. Beginning first with the international comparisons, policing throughout the world is heavily influenced by systems of government. The United States has historically resisted centralized government and instead favored local control. Now, this has led to two issues in American policing: fragmentation and the duplication of services. So local control has resulted in America's policing being fragmented into separate jurisdictions. And at this point, you may be asking yourself, well, how many jurisdictions or how fragmented are our law enforcement? There are 18,000 different law enforcement agencies in the United States. Now, by comparison, England, which is culturally similar, but has 1/4 the population, they have only 43 agencies. The number of law enforcement agencies in the United States has led to a lot of coordination issues and difficulties from one department to the next. So for example, policing in Fort Lauderdale looks very different than policing in Boise, Idaho. The second issue deals with the duplication of services. So I work on the Boca campus. Let's say one of my students gets in a fight and punches another student during my class time. I'm a witness to it. What agency has jurisdiction? So the answer to that is a lot of agencies, including FAU PD, Boca Raton Police Department, Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and 65 other federal law enforcement agencies. Well, who files the report? Technically, all of them can. So we're looking at about 70 different reports for one offense, potentially. Who takes the lead at the crime scene? That's usually a cooperative effort between the agencies, with federal agencies given priority. Who files charges? Well, charges can be filed at special, municipal, state, and federal courts. And each one of those, double jeopardy does not attach. So you're looking at separate levels of charging for the same offense. Now, many agencies have arrangements to avoid such overt instances of service duplication, but with fewer agencies, you're looking at lesser of a problem. And then the final thing I want to acknowledge as it relates to international comparisons is, since we're talking about police funding, it's important to note that in the last 4 decades, law enforcement funding in the United States has tripled. We spend approximately $114.5 billion on law enforcement in the United States. And that averages out to approximately $360 per citizen annually. UK, our prior example, they're going to spend about $228 per citizen annually. It's important to note they also have a lower crime rate. They're spending less and their crime rate is lower. Now, the comparative approach also asks us to look inwardly and reflect on the uniqueness of American policing and its issues. So one of the aspects of American policing that's received a lot of attention are police unions. Police unions have taken on poor salaries, benefits, arbitrary disciplinary procedures and practices. They have, however, become a lightning rod for criticism for defending police behavior, regardless of how egregious it is, and been attached to or assumed to be resistant to change. Now, to that end, police unions have adopted a policy of non-compliance with investigations of their members, and this has led to what academics call the blue wall of silence. Researchers believe that this has promoted an us versus them mentality that further entrenches some of the issues of police-public conflict. The comparative perspective also asks us to take stock of how policing varies within America. So as it relates to cost, the Rand Corporation recently collected an average amount each state spent working violent and property crimes that are reported to police. So along the edge here of this table on this screen, you're going to see the type of offense. The next column represents the minimum a state spent working that offense, and then a column displaying the maximum the state spent working the offense. So you can actually see, you know, like for homicides, 144,000 per homicide is being spent. And then just for fun, along the last column there, I added the FBI's reported proportion of these crimes that are cleared by arrest or exceptional means. So there's a couple of things that can be gleaned from this table. First, states vary in how much they spend, but they're fairly consistent in which offenses receive the most resources. Second, there appears to be a relationship between how much is spent working an offense and the likelihood that that offense is going to be cleared. Though I think we can all acknowledge that like the clearance rates for all of these offenses across the board are fairly low in many instances, with the exception of homicide and I think it's robbery. Yeah, they're all lower than chance. But this is the type of transparency that we need for the next perspective that is rarely available at a localized level. So alternatively, the consumer approach contends that it's our civic responsibility to understand and review how our tax dollars are being spent. We don't need a crisis in policing to do so. Rather, it should be the norm, a check, if you will, on the service quality we receive from our tax dollars. If you went to a new restaurant and received poor service or horrible food, would you want the same server the next time you went back to that restaurant? Would you even go back to that restaurant? Probably not. Would you demand a refund or tell a friend about your poor experiences? Probably. The point is that in addition to being a government and a public safety entity, policing is also a service industry. And if you're not satisfied with the services you're receiving, many don't want to continue to pay for those services. So imagine being forced to go back to the poor restaurant once a month, forking over your hard-earned money for a meal that makes you sick. For some, that's actually a preferable experience than the ones that they have with law enforcement. Another part of the consumer perspective that must be contended with is the fact that resources are not unlimited. They're finite. So where we pick and choose to use them signals our societal values. Now, a somewhat famous example in criminal justice is that between 1965 and 1985, California built 23 prisons, but only 6 universities. This growth signaled to the population in California, we believe that you're 3 times as likely to end up in prison than to end up at a university. All right, so with this context, I think it's important that we distinguish separate conversations occurring around the defund police movement, which include the abolition of police, divesting in policing, how surpluses can be spent, redefining the role of police in our society, and increasing policing. We'll talk about each one of those briefly just now. So there's a tendency among many not to take the abolitionists of police services seriously because they call for the complete disbandment of policing. I think that's unfortunate because it stifled conversations about alternative forms of justice, like social justice, and it devalues alternative systems of justice, like restorative justice. Now, America's adversarial system of justice is clearly not perfect, and we should be doing more to welcome these sort of alternative ideas. Perhaps the most interesting framework being discussed is procedural justice. So I'm not going to bore you with the mountains of evidence that supports this approach or that's been done in this area, only to share with you the tenets, which are fairness, voice, transparency, and impartiality, which I think are values we want to see in our law enforcement. Divesting in police services is different than abolition in that it acknowledges the need for police services, just less of them. So over the years, budgets have expanded and contrasted, and there are two ways that law enforcement agencies have dealt with smaller budgets. The first is through consolidation. Now, this is when agencies band together. You know, a local example of this would be Miami-Dade Police Department. The second way agencies have dealt with shrinking budgets is through contracting out specific services. Now, this is when a jurisdiction will pay for police services to be provided by a larger agency. Lake Worth Police Department, for example, was disbanded in 2008, and the city of Lake Worth contracts police services to be rendered by the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. Smaller police departments also contract for individual services, like the performance of crime laboratory services or evidence processing, because not every police department is going to afford or need their own crime laboratory. So it makes sense that they would just pay the neighboring one that has a crime laboratory for those services when they're needed. So while these agencies may be more efficient, we know very little empirically about their effectiveness. We can say, however, that consolidation and contracting does have a positive impact on the two issues acknowledged at the beginning, which are things like fragmentation and the duplication of services. Likewise, it may also address some of that mission creep that we acknowledged, because departments are then forced to focus their attention and resources only on the most serious offenses. So it's somewhat inevitable for abolition and divestment conversations to lead to discussions about how surplus money will be spent once budgets are cut or eliminated or reduced. Now, these conversations usually go something like this. It's better to spend our tax dollars on blank than policing. These are value statements. Some of the ideas that have been put forth include reinvesting the money in education or in communities that have been historically targeted and disproportionately harmed by police. If we're to talk about education, these folks are saying that they value education spending over police spending. Some people just want a tax dividend or to pay less than tax. I think these are healthy discussions for a civically engaged public to have. So the third conversation occurring around the defund the police movement seeks to redefine policing in America. If you were to build a police department from the ground up, what would it look like? What would it do? I suspect it would be very different than what exists today. Two alternative philosophies in policing have taken hold, albeit like in a limited capacity, and they are problem-oriented policing and community policing. Problem-oriented policing uses the SARA model to identify and analyze specific crime and disorder problems. It then develops a response strategy and assesses its effectiveness. The uniqueness of problem-oriented policing is that it asks officers to address the root cause of crime and disorder, whatever it may be. So it's not limited to just the laws in front of it. Alternatively, community policing seeks to build community ties and work alongside community members. It recognizes that crime control solutions are often the co-production with members of the public, and it seeks to restore public trust and in policing institutions. The final area of the defund police conversation says, if you want better police services, you have to invest more in them. There are also those who state, I'm happy with my existing police services and I want more of them. In both instances, police budgets would increase. So how should police spend this money? Again, these are value statements. Investing in training such as depolicing, or in de-escalation tactics, partnering with healthcare service providers such as social workers, substance abuse counselors, behavioral health crisis centers or personnel, and victim advocacy. All of these ideas that have come forward speak to the individual's values. Finally, I think it's important that we note that these decisions are not made in echo chambers of the internet. There is a fairly comprehensive bureaucracy in place to maintain existing police structures. Municipal police, for example, often report that mayors and city managers control their budgets. Mayors fear cutting police budgets because chiefs of police have not been shy about taking to the nightly news and telling their constituents that crime is going to go up because their budgets are cut. I'm going to challenge this idea. To me, that's a threat. You cut my budget, crime goes up, and I'm not sure that that can be stated. And this is an effective tactic in maintaining police budgets because the electorate has historically been motivated by fear, and the fear of crime is one of the more effective ways at getting people to do things. The point I want to make here is that there are a lot of moving parts to the defund police discussion, and it's a complicated endeavor. Okay, so let's recap. You know, I'm a professor, so we're going to have a recap here. America and policing in America has been and is currently racialized. Comparatively, American policing is fragmented, and there are the duplication of services while costing more than abroad. Union defense of police officers at all costs has further divide, and most crimes in America do not get cleared. The consumer perspective asks us to be civically engaged in how our tax dollars are being spent because they reflect our societal values. The defunding of the police has prompted separate discussions about the abolition of and the divestment in police services. These conversations are often led to discussions of how surplus dollars will be spent. Additionally, we talked about redefining policing and how police should use additional resources if their budgets were to increase, which some have called for. Finally, it's important to note that existing police structures are maintained through a bureaucratic system, and it requires us all to be civically engaged for things to change. Okay, so hopefully that information and context allows us to have a fruitful discussion about defunding police. So at this time, I welcome any questions, comments, or concerns. Once again, thank you for everyone for joining.
Thank you, Dr. Fallik. I'm gonna move to some of the questions that have been presented for you to answer. If you have questions, again, you can put them in the chat window, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And if we're not able to get to them, Dr. Fallik will be hanging around for the final half hour, and we can engage in further conversation there. Okay, so one question is from Abby Clates. Do you believe defund police is a misnomer and would be better served by calling it reform or retrain or redefine police?
Mm. So I think defund police is a bad PR term, you know, for the movement. I think it leads people down a path that that the movement doesn't necessarily endorse. And so of late, folks have felt it necessary to reframe the conversation as divest, so that we can look at how things change in our funding streams. Should we move into, you know, supporting social work and psychologists and folks being helping law enforcement where they don't have the knowledge or expertise? To me, divest seems like, because it also suggests we're making an investment in the community in a different way. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Another question from Donna Estes is, given the propensity for violence and the love of guns in the country, I fear we could have race wars. Any thoughts on that?
Things are scary right now. Certainly a armed public makes those encounters deadly. But I also see moments of nonviolence and peaceful engagement in discourse. And so because of that, I'm optimistic. You know, I had somebody ask me, and I didn't have the answer, but they offered a suggestion. Why now? You know, why wasn't it, you know, why not Philando Castillo? Why not Michael Brown? Why not Tamir Rice? Why not the names that I've listed off? Why not Rodney King? Why is George Floyd the case? And it gets wrapped up in a conversation about COVID. So for the first time in a lot of people's lives, they're not taking the kids to soccer practice. They're still, and they've had a moment to think, and they believe the times are that what's going on is unjust, and their willingness to take action. But when you're wrapped up in your schedules and work and taking kids to soccer, you don't really have that time to reflect. So COVID might have actually spurred this movement because people were able to reflect on the times.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Margarita Castellon. Prior to the current defund police climate, were discussions ongoing regarding redefining policing? And was there already an awareness that this needed to happen, and what informed that view?
You know, I don't think that that chiefs in particular felt their pocketbooks threatened. What I think they were always encouraged to think about was how to evolve. If you're not evolving as a department, you're falling behind because society is constantly evolving. And so I think the public saying, if you're not going to change, we're going to stop paying for, I think that has really put a fire, you know, in some of these discussions. As I said in the presentation, police chiefs have really benefited from the threat of going to the nightly news and saying crime is going to go up. And so they've really insulated themselves from budget talks altogether. And when they pivot the conversation to, well, we want it spent on, you know, psychological services or community services or, you know, substance abuse services, things that could do some good, that put a little bit more traction to the conversation and people got behind it.
Thank you. The next question comes from Clarence Brooks. He says, thank you for challenging the threat of the idea of maintaining police budgets. So many areas have had to deal with budget cuts. Are there instances where police budgets have been successfully cut? Why the focus towards more militarized police?
So I went to a talk last week where there were a lot of chief executives involved in the talk. And one of the things that came out of it was the chiefs basically saying, if you cut our budget, there's only 10% of our budget that actually covers the militarization, the vests, the camo and things like that. The other 90% is actually going towards personnel. And so what I thought was pretty interesting was they were saying, this chief in particular was saying, if you cut, you can cut that 10%, but after that, you're talking about cutting warm bodies. And to which I think the members of the public were like, well, yeah, we want fewer police officers. And so there's a trade-off, though. You're replacing those officers with what? Are you getting a tax dividend? Are you, providing a different type of police service? To go back, we've seen ebbs and flows of budgets, not just in policing, but in other spaces. And so they're not alone in having to deal with budget cuts. What's been interesting is that the rise of their budgets has been so dramatic in such a short period of time that they've had the ability to embrace some things which I think are a bit silly. There's no reason for a local law enforcement agency to have an MRAP or like a tank. You don't need a tank. There's very few instances where you need a tank domestically. But I will say I've heard some local justifications. So Delray Police Department has an MRAP. It's labeled and branded with the police services, but it's never used for riots. It's used for search and rescue. So it's lifted, and should a hurricane come, it has the ability to navigate high waters and do rescue. But when you see this thing that they troll out, it's misrepresenting what they're actually doing. And they're doing something that I actually support. So label it search and rescue as opposed to policing, because that's not what it's used for.
Thank you. The next question is from Claudia Solomon, and Claudia says, I'm all for taking funds from police to free up the officers to handle more violent crimes, using those funds for social workers and other professionals to work with nonviolent issues. How much do police unions factor into this conversation?
Heavily. So this is a space that I don't know that we have a good answer for, because police unions are powerful. But I think it's really important that we acknowledge the good work that they've done, not just in policing, but in other fields, working for workers' rights. So in policing in particular, we feel an affront when they pay for legal services for an officer who's engaged in something egregious. It seems apparent, right? There's body-worn camera footage. It could be the worst of the worst. Why would you defend them? The reality is they defend everybody who pays their dues. And that's what the dues are there for, is so that you're ensuring, should something go sideways, I'm going to have the ability to receive legal representation, as opposed to me trying to finance that for myself as a lowly police officer. So they've done it. I think we're concerned about how far they've gone, right? We're concerned, we don't have a concern for them representing maybe questionable cases, but how far they've gone. And I don't know how you stymie that. And I don't know, where they could do less, but they certainly seem to be contributing to an us versus them mentality among law enforcement and this sentiment in a way that is not healthy.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And that question is, has any model been, this is from Catherine Molinet, and she's asking, has any model been developed that addresses a coordination of policing, mental health, and social services, all working in a more coordinated system?
So yes, there's a bunch of different programs and attempts, and they look different, and they're in different places throughout the country. I'll talk about one being the task force model. So a task force model bridges or makes connections between agencies, not just law enforcement, and those agencies then serve to coordinate with one another the responses. And so you have a representative from multiple community agencies. And the task force model works because everybody at the table has one vote. And so when you have equity across the decision making, that's more likely to promote a more well-rounded response. The problem is these task force look completely different and have different members and service different objectives. And so it's really hard to pin down their effectiveness. This should sort of speak to where we are now. I'm actually a member of a task force. And so this is a academic sitting at the table with a whole bunch of law enforcement engaging in dialogue as it relates to gun and gang violence. So they come to me asking for evidence-based responses, and I tell them, you know, usually what they're pontificating is not going to work. And so I'm loved and at that table. But the fact that they're willing to engage, I think we're at the forefront of these discussions right now. We target individual problems, sort of in the problem-oriented policing approach, and then we construct a team. And then the willingness or ability of team members to be interchanged and how well they participate with one another or participate at all really varies in their success.
Thank you so much for taking the time to address some of the questions here. Again, we will be here 30 minutes after we close out, so we could continue discussion there. I want to thank you, Dr. Falik and Nailise, for joining us tonight. It's wonderful to collaborate with you and have you join us for our OLLI Fort Lauderdale programming. To everybody else, we hope to see you again. Our next program actually is Thursday, August 6th. It's the third session in this 4-part series. Discussion with New York Times author Gabriel Bump on his new book, Everywhere You Don't Belong. He'll be discussing the new novel. And this is also hosted in conjunction with the Palm Beach Book Festival at FAU, and Dean Horswell will be here with us on that evening, joining us again. That wraps up tonight's Dialogues for Change. We want to thank you for joining us, and we hope that you stay healthy and well, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Again, feel free to stick around to continue the conversation. Also, our co-hosts for tonight, Karen and Dreja, will be there to address any questions that you have about our OLLI programming moving forward. And again, thank you to everybody, and we look forward to seeing you again.